Some of you came as convicts and servants, forced by the famine or transportation, and no one could feel the pain or the heartache when you found yourself exiled from family and friends.
Now this song, Follow the Call, was chosen by Brian Edmund Gleeson as an introduction to his course. And Brian is a genealogist from Melbourne, Australia. He's a past councillor, including secretary of the Genealogical Society of Victoria. He has done extensive research over several decades, which culminated in Brian's acclaimed seminal work, A Gleeson Butler Story from Kilkenny Ireland to Port Phillip Australia. Brian is a 1957 Brownlow Medallist, award for Best and Fairest Australian Rules Footballer, and has appeared on TV, radio, and in news, press, as well as acting as a keynote speaker on behalf of the Genealogical Society of Victoria. So could you all put your hands together for Brian Edmund Gleeson.
Sharing your music, your stories, your pain. I follow the call of the people before me. I follow the call of my own Celtic blood. I follow the call, cross the waves and the oceans. I follow the call to the land that I love. Down through the ages, a new generation. Now we have a future of promise and pride, 'cause we are a product of your toil and your struggle, and our own Celtic spirit burns proudly inside. I follow the call of the people before me. I follow the call of my own Celtic blood. I follow the call, cross the waves and the oceans. I follow the call to the land that I love.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I feel very privileged to be able to come over across the ocean and to the land of my ancestors and to meet you people at this Gleeson gathering. Today I'm going to introduce you to my Gleeson ancestors, discuss those who emigrated to Australia, what happened to them there, and briefly mention some standouts amongst their descendants. I'll lead off with my earliest known ancestor, John Gleeson. Born around 1755, give or take 10 years. John's occupation was blacksmith. He was married to Catherine Brennan. They had a son named Edward, who was born about 1783. And that's the brick wall. I'd like to know more about this John Gleeson, where he was born, lived, died, what other children he may have had, and where does this John Gleeson fit into the broader Gleeson clan? But until we find that out, let's deal with what we have. His son Edward Gleeson was born about 1783 and died in Australia in 1877. He was married to Mary Lyons of Gowran, Kilkenny. Edward and Mary's first son was a John Gleeson, baptised at Gowran on the 24th of December 1815, and that's my earliest hard record. 9 or 10 other children are on the same baptismal register. Edward was listed in the 1825 Tithes of Allotment book for Gowran, and he was listed in the 1850 Griffiths valuation at Gowran at 39 Main Street. We visited it on Wednesday, I beg your pardon. Now, Edward was the patriarch of my Gleeson from Gowran, but I doubt that he was indigenous to Gowran. And I acknowledge that there were other Gleesons and Gleesons in Gowran at that time. So my talk will discuss Edward and Mary Gleeson and their 7 adult sons who emigrated to Australia between 1848 and 1853, as shown on this display chart. An obituary of Edward Gleeson in the Advocate newspaper, the one for the Catholic Archdiocese of Melbourne in 1877, stated that Edward was aged 94 when he died. I'd like to quote just a few words from that obituary. On many a cold winter's night, sitting by a blazing fire, he would narrate to an attentive auditory how he handled his pike in '98. And to hear him describe the troublous times that preceded Catholic emancipation would open the eyes of the present generation of Catholics. His description of life in the early days of Victoria were also exceedingly interesting. Now, these words raise a lot of questions, but they don't offer us any answers. For example, did Edward actually fight in the uprising of 1798? Don't know. Did his blacksmith father make his pike? Don't know. However, they do indicate that Edward was an enchanting storyteller, and that he lived through some challenging and interesting phases of Irish and Australian history. There is little doubt that he was closely connected to his sons, so their stories are part of his story. During the 24 years he lived in Australia. His first 4 emigrant sons arrived in Australia before Edward and Mary. They came to what is now the state of Victoria, down in the bottom right-hand side of that map. Before 1851, it was grey-coloured like that and was part of the colony of New South Wales. The map of Australia has changed substantially. But after it became the colony of Victoria, 2 major and unexpected happenings occurred. But before we look at those happenings, we'll turn the next map if we may, please, Morris. Yes, let's just look at this map of Victoria, and I'll point out some places that will be discussed or mentioned so that you'll understand them a little bit. Melbourne is at the top of the Port Phillip Australia, and that's the capital of Australia now, and it has 5 million people. Coming down the western side, that's my side, you'll see Geelong just here. Sorry I can't read it. And that is a pivotal place in this story. From Geelong, we can go up here to Ballarat. Ballarat was where the Eureka Stockade took place and the gold rush started. The gold also went up to Bendigo. Where are we? Up there. And we're near number 5, yes. And that'll be mentioned. And up from Ballarat is a place called Ararat. That'll go mentioned too for reasons you'll see later. But going back to these major happenings, the first is succinctly explained in Wikipedia in these words. In December 1851, gold was found near Ballarat and soon after in Bendigo and many places nearby and in between. This triggered one of the largest. The colony of Victoria grew rapidly in both people and economic power. In 10 years, the population of Victoria increased from sevenfold, from 76,000 to 540,000. All sorts of gold records were set, including the largest alluvial gold field in the world and the largest gold nugget. Victoria produced in the decade 1851 to 1860 20 million ounces of gold, 1/3 of the world output. The second major happening was after the gold petered out. The government of the colony of Victoria released land for sale on very favourable terms, enabling many people to purchase their own land. Now, looking at these immigrant Gleesons again, the first to arrive was Edmund Gleeson Jr, born 1821, number 3 in the family. He sailed into Port Phillip on the Lady Peel on the 16th of February 1848. He left the ship of his own accord, which means he had someone here to take responsibility for him. Here meaning there. So I'm having a little bit of trouble reading in this light. By 1854, that's within 6 years, Edward Gleeson Jr was the licensee of the Harp Inn. It was at a place called Ashby, which is now part of Geelong West. It had been built in 1848. Nowadays, it's a registered heritage building, currently being used as a Thai restaurant. Edward married a lady named Bridget Burke at Geelong in 1854. They were to have 11 children, 8 of whom survived infancy. In 1856, Edward took advantage of the land opportunity and purchased 70 acres at the Anarchy, Victoria. That 70 acres is the darkened bit on the right-hand side there. Later, in 1870, he obtained another 122 acres. And then, that's down the bottom, and then directly above that, another purchase of 320 acres by 1877. He must have been a reasonable smart fellow, because soon after his arrival in the Anarchy district, Edward was appointed by the Colony's Board of Education to serve on the committee responsible for the Anarchy's first school, which opened in 1859. And later, in 1874, Edward was elected to serve on the Meredith Shire Council. He represented the East Riding, in which Anarchy was located, until his death some 13 years later. I'd say well done, Edward Gleeson. Second to arrive were 2 brothers, the first and the second in the family, John and Patrick, as seen on the chart. John settled in Melbourne, where his in-laws had a hotel in King Street. John had married Bridget into Gowran, Kilkenny in 1845, and Bridget and their son, Michael Thomas Gleeson, aged 5, arrived 1 year later on the ship Harry Lorrequer. Bridget was sponsored by one Martin Healy, who also lived in King Street, Melbourne. He likewise migrated from Gowran, Kilkenny, having arrived in 1841. When John Gleeson died at age 67, he was a grocer at 205 King Street, Melbourne. You might say he was well established in that fast-growing city, which, as I said before, has 5 million people, which I think is pretty close to what the population of the Republic of Ireland is. Now, there was a standout member of his family, and that was that Michael Thomas Gleeson, who came out from Ireland. Michael established a very successful recycling business with 2 branches in Melbourne and others in Ballarat and Adelaide, Adelaide being the capital of South Australia. This enabled him to provide well for his large family and also contribute notable public service as a councillor and mayor of Hotham Town, which is now part of the North Melbourne part of the city of Melbourne. Michael was also president of the local North Melbourne Football Club, which today is a member club of the Australian Football League. He was later chairman of a major fundraising for his parish church, Sacred Heart, at the then upmarket suburb of St Kilda. He was also a major annual donor to a large orphanage set up by the St Vincent de Paul Society of South Melbourne. He was to marry twice and father to 13 children. Now, Michael Thomas Gleeson had descendants that had a bit of a diaspora amongst themselves. But he also had people who followed in his footsteps. One of Michael's descendants, a grandson, followed a similar path as a successful businessman, a shire councillor and mayor, a justice of the peace, a president of the Rotary Club of Geelong, and he's with us today. Take a stand. Leon Gleeson from Geelong, Victoria. And with him is his dear wife, Stephanie, and son, Michael. Michael's come all the way from Switzerland with his Swiss bride to be here today to learn a little bit about it. But there's more. One of Michael's daughters married a man from North America, and 2 granddaughters married in USA and raised families there. So present with us today is a great-granddaughter of Michael Thomas Gleeson from Nevada City, USA, Diane Covington Carter. Go on, Diane. Diane is a journalist or a photographer, a writer, a winning writer and a photographer and a teacher of some note. And Diane's going to write a story for her local newspaper about this Gleeson clan gathering. Now, the other second to arrive brother was the second eldest son, Patrick. He was 30 years old at the time. A local historian, Mrs. M.G. McNaughton, in an article published in Investigator, the Journal of the Geelong Historical Society, stated, Patrick Gleeson was a carpenter and builder, but joined the gold rush to the diggings and did fairly well. He returned to his trade in 1853 at Geelong. On the 23rd of May that year, Patrick married Mary Broderick, and they lived in Kildare, which is also part of what is now West Geelong. They were to have 10 children. Some 30 years later, the Irish-born journalist and author James Francis Hogan described Kildare as a thriving corner of Geelong. He wrote, It was in Geelong that the first glad tidings of gold were announced, and it was from Geelong that the largest contingent of the Diggers' Army started to try their luck. When they reached their destination, they settled down to the work of gold finding. They drew their supplies from Geelong as being the nearest and most accessible seaport. Thus, the lovely harbour of Geelong became crowded with shipping, and at the western end of the town there sprang into existence the bustling suburb of Kildare, which was peopled almost exclusively by Irish carriers and their families. I suggest you remember that quote because Kildare was adjacent to Ashby, where Edward Gleeson had the Harp Inn and his brother Martin had the store next door. They were well located to serve the people going to the goldfields, and all probability used Kildare carriers to send further supplies to clients at Ballarat and other goldfields. Now is a good time to view a map of Port Phillip Bay and note a couple of triangles. Melbourne is on the top of the bay, and if you come down this side to Geelong, that's where we're talking about at the moment. Take it up to the top corner here to Ballarat, and that was the way to Ballarat, because if you take the line down from Ballarat to Melbourne, there was no road there at that time. There are mountains in that area that hadn't been passed. So all traffic from Melbourne or from the harbour of Geelong went to Ballarat up that way through West Geelong, where the Gleesons had their hotel, the Harp Inn, and their store. Also, within here there's another triangle. Up here to a place called Anarchy, and along here to a place called Little River. And that's where Gleeson's got land. But back to Patrick. In 1856, Patrick Gleeson and his wife Mary and their first two children at Geelong left Geelong for a new life on the land at Little River. That was the second of those places I pointed out. It's about 30 kilometres northeast of Geelong. They called their property Avonmore. And again, I'll quote Mrs. McNaughton, the historian, "The Gleeson property appears to have become a focus for social life in their small rural community, and early records depict Patrick and Mary as pioneers of the finest character and Avonmore as a family centre of hospitality and generosity." Patrick and Mary later obtained additional farming land which left their children well provided for. They also inspired in their children the benefit of a good education. And this flowed on to the next generation, where we find some well-educated standouts. The first of these is Huey Devine, a grandson of Patrick and through his daughter Mary Ann. He was knighted for his contribution to surgery. He was recognised on the world stage and invited to do lecture tours in New Zealand, Great Britain and USA. After his death, in his honour, the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons, of which he was one of the founders and its driving force, struck a medal. It was titled the Sir Hugh Devine Medal for Meritorious Service to Surgery, and on it is inscribed the words, "The highest honour that the college can bestow upon a fellow in his lifetime." Hugh Devine's son, John Devine, was also to win fame for himself. As a surgeon doctor in the Australian Army Field Hospital at Trabuc during the Desert Campaign against the German forces led by Field Marshal Rommel, John Devine was mentioned in dispatches. John later wrote a book about those experiences, which he titled The Rats of Trabuc. The Australian Commander-in-Chief, General Sir Thomas Blamey, wrote the foreword to this book. It is now a classic of Australian military history. And another grandson of Patrick Gleeson excelled himself as a Jesuit priest. Father Philip Gleeson was the first Australian Jesuit to be appointed as rector to the prestigious Xavier College in Melbourne, where, as a student, he had been school captain and captain of both football and cricket. He went on to become the rector of Newman College at the University of Melbourne, followed by other international leadership roles in the Jesuit order. Now we'll move on to the fourth Gowran Gleeson to arrive. It was Martin Gleeson, who travelled on the ship Constance. Well, now I used the photo of the ship Constance for my book because I thought it was very nice, but the other reason is because it set the record from Plymouth to Adelaide in 77 days. So if any trip took, if anybody came out to Australia in those days from England, it would have been somewhat more than 77 days. In October 1850, Martin sailed into Port Phillip and we'll take his story from there. But before I do, I'm going to defer to a little family story. When I was age 9, my father, Jim Gleeson, showed me a photo of Gleeson's Hotel in Ballarat. He was in the process of sending this photo with his story to people who had advertised for material about Ballarat around the time of the Eureka Stockade to aid them in making a film about this event. The film was released in 1949. Dad told me, "This is where your great-grandfather hid Peter Lawler, the leader of the miners, after the Eureka Stockade, when the police were looking for him." Well, his story never made the cut, and the photo was never returned. The Eureka Stockade event was pivotal in the history of the colony of Victoria, and Peter Lawler was a major player. Volumes have been written about it, but in a nutshell, it was a protest by miners on the Ballarat goldfields against the colonial administration, the miners having to pay crippling fees for mining licences irrespective of their level of success, and for the police bashings and bullying during licence inspections. Ultimately, some 10,000 miners held a meeting at Bakery Hill in Ballarat, elected Peter Lawler as their leader, clarified their grievances, burnt their licences, then barricaded themselves in a flimsy stockade and raised the Southern Cross flag. Guess what the password was for that stockade? It was Vinegar Hill. Obviously, Vinegar Hill and lots of Irishmen on the Ballarat goldfields had an impact on this happening. An attack was made on the miners by government troops and police before daybreak on Sunday the 3rd of December 1854. In the ensuing battle, 22 miners and 5 army men were killed. Many miners were taken prisoner. A price of hundreds of pounds was put on the head of Peter Lawler, but no one dobbed him in. He had been badly wounded in the battle and needed an arm amputation to save his life. That was done in the tent of the priest, Father Patrick Smythe. For the next 2 weeks, Lawler was kept hidden in a miner's tent. He then escaped Ballarat, hidden in a dray by a Kildare carrier, Patrick Carroll. By lonely bush tracks away from the main routes, Lawler was conveyed to the Geelong South home of his fiancée, schoolteacher Alicia Dunn, where he recovered. In this journey, the Carroll dray would have passed near the Harp Inn at Geelong West. It would have been well known to Patrick Carroll. The public were very much on the side of the miners. The trial of 13 prosecuted miners became a farce. No one was convicted. They and all the others who had been imprisoned were released. pressure was on the government. The Eureka event led the government to change the administration of the goldfield, alter the licensing system, and establish a legislative assembly with members elected by the public. But back to Martin Gleeson. Was he involved in hiding Peter Lawler when the police were looking for him? Well, certainly not at the Eglinton Hotel in Ballarat, as my father had believed. My father was a farmer, not a researcher. The Eglinton Hotel came 8 years later. Martin, or his brother Edward, had the Harp Inn at the time. And there are a number of indicators that put Martin and other Gleesons in the ballpark of closely knowing Lawler and the Eureka escapees, or many of them. One was in Martin's obituaries of 1903, where a mention was made of him assisting miners after Eureka. And the Harp Inn was strategically located where it was easy for a Kildare carrier with Peter Lawler on board to access refreshments or other assistance while keeping out of sight. Martin Gleeson and Peter Lawler both married in 1855, less than 5 months apart, in the same Catholic parish of St Mary's, Geelong. Were they already known to one another? Martin Gleeson's brother Michael, who we'll talk about shortly, was taken prisoner at Eureka after the Stockade event, and he must have known Peter Lawler and could have been a conduit. But back to Martin Gleeson himself again. I believe he was the most enterprising of the 7 brothers who emigrated from Gowran. He did well enough out of the Harp Inn and the store next door to purchase the burnt-down Eglinton Hotel in Ballarat and the block of land next door. It was here that he built a new state-of-the-art hotel, Gleeson's Eglinton Hotel in Main Road, Ballarat. This was described in the Geelong Advertiser in February 1864 as follows. Architecturally designed by a Mr Jones and built by Messrs Nichols and Ellis and a Mr Lovell, it cost £2,000. It contained a basement with a kitchen and cellar, etc., a spacious bar and 3 sitting rooms on the ground floor, and 7 bedrooms and a large room measuring 30 feet by 18 feet on the first floor. Design was of the Italian order, with 5 Roman arched windows facing the streetscape on the first floor. But there's more. In 1868, Martin Gleeson purchases 460 acres of land at the government auction sales at Ararat. He was to become a very successful farmer and grazier at Kiora, south of Ararat by about 20 kilometres. Over the years he made multiple additional purchases from unsuccessful settlers. He ultimately accumulated some 7,000 acres and set up 3 sons with substantial properties. I happen to grow up in one of them. Martin Gleeson and Margaret Butler had 11 children, of which 3 sons and 5 daughters survived infancy. Pardon me. Martin Gleeson's sons and most of his grandsons were farmers, but the world was changing after World War II and it became obvious that higher education was needed for a good future. The great-grandsons tended to be better educated and moved to the cities. Nowadays there are no Gleesons remaining on those land estates that Martin Gleeson and his heirs had accumulated and farmed. However, the Gleeson spirit of community service persisted amongst his descendants. There's also some history of sporting success in Australian rules football. My deceased brother, Gerald Gleeson, is a good example. Gerald won 2 premiership medals with the Melbourne Football Club in the highest level competition, then known as the VFL, now called the AFL, the Australian Football League. He also graduated Bachelor of Commerce at the University of Melbourne. I think he was the first descendant of Martin Gleeson to get a university degree. The second one is John Lardner, who's sitting here in the front seat. Stand up for a moment, John. John's a pharmacist. Here. John's from Ballarat. Anyway, after Gerald got a university degree, he later served 10 years as a councillor for the city of Moorabbin, which had over 200,000 people, and he had a term as mayor. That funny-looking fellow there also had a moment in the sun with the St Kilda Football Club. When aged 22, I won the St Kilda Club's championship as a club player, and also the Brownlow Medal, the award for the best and fairest player in the league. Unfortunately, I turned from top rooster to feather duster when I was seriously injured at the start of the next season, never to play again. And another easy example is my cousin Desmond Gleeson, a great-grandson of Martin Gleeson, who in 1990 was awarded Citizen of the Year by the City of the Gold Coast in Queensland, 500,000 people, for his services to the community. He's with us today. Please take a stand, Des Gleeson. And the only other fellow who came from Australia is Brian Cronin, who's sitting there, and he thinks he's an Irishman. He's been here 14 times. Stand up, Brian, just to introduce people. And he's also taken out Irish citizenship. Yeah. So let's move on to Michael Gleeson, who was born at Gowran, and we next find him as best man at the wedding of his brother Patrick in Melbourne, 30 years later. Michael was the one arrested at Eureka shortly after the 3rd of December 1854. The Argus newspaper a week later reported, at the police court on Saturday, Michael Gleeson and 23 other named men were discharged. In some cases, there was either no evidence against the prisoners, or they were only proved guilty of living in the neighbourhood of the stockade and giving no information as to its erection. After Eureka, Michael became the owner of 80 acres of land in the same subdivision where his brother Edward Gleeson had obtained his land. And the licence for the transfer of this land was applied for by Michael on the 15th of February 1873. With the normal 7-year terms, this meant he probably settled there in 1866. Before someone got the licence for the land, there had to be a bailiff's report, and this stated, the improvements on the land are of a substantial nature. There are 2 houses and worth £60. The quality of fencing is fair and worth £50. 9 acres cleared cost about £15, and the water hull £10. The transfer was completed in June 1873 on the payment of the balance of £5, 7 shillings and 6pence, bringing the total paid for the 80 acres to £80 exactly. In other words, they got land for £1 an acre and they had 7 years to pay it off. Michael Gleeson did not marry, so the existence of 2 houses leads me to believe that his parents lived there with him and that's where Edward Sr. died. Michael Gleeson himself died alone 22 years later, at age 76, and because he was alone, there was a magisterial inquiry required, and that declared that he died of a heart attack. Now, there are two remaining brothers, the two youngest, and they remained single and disconnected from their older siblings and ultimately suffered tragic ends to their lives. It appears that Thomas Gleeson was afflicted with a debilitating mental illness from which he would never recover. In 1870, he was admitted to the Gowran Lunatic Asylum, and in 1883 he was moved to the distant Beechworth Asylum, and he died there on the 26th of June 1898. Substantial asylum records tell his occupation as minor, and the apparent cause of his illness was anxiety of mind consequent upon loss of money. And James Gleeson became an itinerant miner and died in 1905 after being brought into the Ballarat Place Hospital in a close-to-death condition. No one present knew the names of his parents. He had outlived them and all his siblings. So ends my story of how the life played out for the Gleesons from Gowran after they emigrated to Australia. They made their mark, they left a valuable legacy in Australia. And as Maria Ford's song, Follow the Call, so eloquently stated, down through the ages, a new generation, we have a future of promise and pride, because we are a product of your toil and your struggle, and our own Celtic spirit burns proudly inside. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Brian. Brian is hopeful that through introducing Gleesons from Gowran and Kilkenny at this planned gathering, and with the results of his Y-DNA test, that he'll be able to connect to John Gleeson, born about 1755, and his other children, if any. So if anybody thinks they might be connected to Brian, do take down his email, keep in touch, and also read the story of Martin Gleeson from Gowran, Kilkenny on the website of the Ballarat and District Genealogical Society. All you have to do is Google Eureka, Martin Gleeson, Gowran, Kilkenny, and it'll come up in your browser. Also have a look at Brian's book, A Gleeson Butler Story, and here it is here. And Brian, you have some free copies to give away today?
I have one to give away to the person who leads me to John Gleeson.
So anyone who connects Brian and John Gleeson gets a free book. And Mike bought one already, so you know it's got to be good.
He'll get a refund if he...
If Mike finds it, he'll get a refund of the book. But it's a great book, very well researched book, Gleeson Butler Story, and there on the front cover is the clipper that took them 77 days from Plymouth to Australia. So, questions for Brian? Any questions or any comments? Obviously there's quite a large Australian contingent here today. And one Yank. We have a question back here.
Brian, I don't actually have a question, but you've answered something for me. When my husband retired from the Aussie Navy, we went round with some friends who were looking for their ancestors. Their names were actually Murphy, and they apparently came from Ararat. We didn't find any Murkoviches, but we found lots of Gleesons. And I couldn't understand how on earth all these Gleesons got to Ararat, but now I know. So thank you very much.
Very good.
We've got to talk then afterwards, yeah. All right, there might be a free book for you now.
John and Leon both grew up in Ararat, spent time in Ararat.
Any other questions for Brian? Yeah, we have a question over here.
Thanks, Brian. I find that absolutely fascinating. I'm not a Cusack, by the way. I'm from Western Australia, living in County Meath. But I did live in Melbourne 6 years at one time, so it's absolutely fascinating, the connections with Geelong. I was in Newman College for a couple of years, so I'd certainly heard of Father Philip Gleeson anyway, but the rest of it was all new to me. I also became very familiar with that territory between Warrnambool and Port Fairy, around Killarney and Karoi, which is probably the most Irish area in Australia. And there's a big crowd of Gleesons down there. In fact, it's the most popular name down there. They immigrated from Tipperary after the Great Famine. I imagine that there's no direct connection between the Karoi-Killarney Gleesons in your own, is there?
Is this working? Yes, it is. Yes. I can tell you that I contacted quite a number of those Gleesons to invite them to come to this event, and the fire seemed to be alight for a while, but it went out, and they didn't come. But my understanding, that at least one of the groups of Gleesons down there came out of Limerick. I don't know about, you said Clare, did you?
Well, I would have thought Clare.
Yeah, well, I think there may be some down there that way too who came from Clare as well. Yeah. Yes, and there's others up in Bendigo that I can't remember where they came from, but I've got copies of their family books and stuff that have been written. Yeah.
We have a question down here at the end from Laura. Please, Laura. I'm going to walk all the way down. Why are you sitting at the back? Why are you sitting at the back? You should get there at the front.
Not a question now, just a comment for Brian. It was my great-granduncle that was the little boy that ran for the doctor that had his leg amputated, that man that had his leg amputated in the Eureka Stockade.
Sorry, what's happening is the sound is going back there and I'm missing it. The sound is going back there, Nora, and I'm missing it. I'm behind, but I walk
Can
down.
you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Okay, Brian, can you hear me now? Yes? Okay. It's not a question, it's just a comment to say that it was my great-granduncle who was the little boy who ran for the doctor for that man who had his leg amputated at the Eureka Stockade.
Was he your relative?
Yes, he's my great-granduncle. The two boys who went out, yes.
I remember it was a sort of, half-hour thing about what happened at Eureka. When Peter Waller needed a doctor, I had to send someone for the doctor. Things were pretty tough. Army people, police were all around, and they chose a 14-year-old lad who, my understanding was, and Nora's corrected me on this, who had come out on his own from Silverline, and his name was Paddy Gleeson. Now, I came across this Paddy Gleeson when I was looking for our Patrick Gleeson. I found he'd gone to New Zealand, and I read that he was drowned on the Shotover River at the gold field there. But I later got picked up on the internet by a lady called Helen Holland in Auckland, and she sent me a copy of a book that had been written about their family and included this Patrick Gleeson. And she said that was reported he was drowned, but wasn't true. What happened? I'll tell you in a moment. But when he was a 14-year-old, he was sent for the doctor to come and fix up, cut off the arm of Peter Lawler. And he went through the lines and brought the doctor back. And Lawler very much appreciated it. And Lawler went on to become a politician. and he had a cavalcade through Ballarat at the time. And on the cavalcade ride, he saw young Patrick Gleeson, and he invited him up into his carriage to ride with him, you know, out of appreciation for him saving his life, basically. And this Patrick Gleeson did go to New Zealand, and instead of being drowned, he became probably one of the most successful men ever in New Zealand. He finished up with a bundle of hotels, a brewery, and substantial land holdings, and was very highly regarded. Yeah, that's
But
the
he
story
did
of it.
emigrate. His younger brother William went with him. The two of them
Yes,
left.
that's
That's right.
details.
Yeah, but you didn't know that part. And both of them worked the gold mines in Ballarat, and then they moved up to the Shotover River around the Ortega region, and then later on up around Pans in the Carmichael area.
Yes, but the people who wrote the book didn't further have a brother, did they?
Yeah. Yes, they did. Yeah, Malcolm Hardy. But that Paddy Gleeson's granddaughter, there's a generation because he was a bit old when he got married, but his granddaughter, who was 82 years of age, came home in 2012, with 12-14, we did mini Gleeson gathering, and she came home from New Zealand. She's still alive, Paddy Gleeson's granddaughter.
Okay.
And alive and well.
Yeah. It's a good story, everyone.
Great, fabulous. Any other comments or questions for Brian? Well, listen, thank you, Brian, for a fantastic talk. Brian, please.